Hi, I'm Zachary Farnell. Thank you for joining me for another edition of your Timberlane Weather Update. This is the first Timberlane Weather Update in 2 weeks now, and although we have not been dealing with some very extreme weather conditions here in New England, down in the southeast of the country, they have been. On top of our regularly scheduled broadcast, I hope to remember those who lost their lives in Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton that have hit combined over the last 2 weeks, including Milton that hit just last night and early this morning. So I hope to shed some light on some survivor stories and kind of give an idea of just how catastrophic those hurricanes were. That will be at the end of our regularly scheduled broadcast. So for now, let's get into some New England weather and what we've been dealing with recently. And I can tell you one word, it's been a whole lot of fall. For much of the area across the last couple days, we've been seeing, again, those temperatures kind of dipping lower than we've seen in many, many months. You see some of those greens and even some of those very light blues up into the Adirondacks. That is temperatures for the highs yesterday, only reaching into the 50s in some areas, although as you get towards southern New England, you are still seeing those 60s, maybe some 70s as you look towards New York and Philadelphia. But overnight, we really saw those low temperatures kicking in. Much of New England saw those temperatures dipping into the 40s, maybe even some northern parts of New England seeing those upper 30s. I can tell you who definitely saw those upper 30s though. Look at Michigan and much of the Great Lakes region as a whole, actually, dealing with some of those temperatures dipping into the upper 20s for parts of southern Ontario in Canada. So this area dealing with a cold snap all of a sudden that is warranted frost warnings and some hard freeze warnings from the National Weather Service. This cold expected to move generally into our area, and that's why today you woke up this morning, you felt the chilly air still around. Today, much of the highs only reaching into, again, those mid to low 50s. As you get towards the coast, it's a little bit warmer, but not a whole lot warmer. This is a very stark contrast from what we've been seeing continually across the central U.S. A warm October for these areas. We're in towards Texas. Although we expect it to be warm, we're not expecting to still be seeing 80s and maybe even some 90s down into this area as we see the 70s streaming up north of the Canadian border. That comes with a whole lot of cloud separation. Really no clouds into this area, very clear. Not what we saw yesterday in towards Florida. You can see what's left of Hurricane Milton down floating around that area. It's a bit disorganized and it's been wind sheared off, meaning that much of the strength of the storm is separated from the center of it. That's a clear sign of a weakening storm, so that's a very good sign for any boats or anyone in the path of this thing as it continues to move away. It should continue to weaken over the next couple of days, and we see that on our fronts map. You can see this is for Friday, for tomorrow. This is just a low pressure system now, no longer expected to hold those tropical characteristics, no longer expected to hold the name hurricane or tropical storm Milton. Although we will still be seeing some showers and thunderstorms in towards Florida, we see a high pressure system that held it off away from the southeast, very thankfully, because if this thing had drifted up into North Carolina, it could have been truly catastrophic. But this high pressure system extends out towards our area almost. It's hard to see, but that lack of cloud and lack of cloud coverage and lack of rain we're continuing to see into tomorrow, although we get a little bit more tricky as we head towards the weekend. This is now Saturday. See a bit of a cold front moving across much of the area that is associated with some of those cold temperatures up into Canada, and that will trigger the beginning of a low pressure system building across the Midwest of the country. We see this one begin to push our way as we get towards Sunday, and you see a big rainstorm activated across much of the northeast of the country and the Midwest. This one expected to warm our temperatures up temporarily on Sunday. You'll see in a short minute what that looks like, but again, that rain still coming across much of the northeast as we talked about earlier. On the 10-day forecast, the 5-day forecast, excuse me, you can see our temperatures have been very chilly recently. Tomorrow, only expecting the mid-60s, and in towards Saturday and Sunday, expect those upper 60s to quickly dive back down into the mid-50s. And as we get in towards Monday and Tuesday, we continue to see those temperatures very cold. Look at those low temperatures diving below 40 degrees next early Monday and Tuesday. In the morning, you're expecting next Monday, your Columbus Day off. looks like it's going to be pretty chilly with some morning showers. On now the 10-day extended forecast, we see a whole lot of sunshine. That's the one good thing with this low pressure system. It's going to clear all the moisture right out of the atmosphere for us, and that cold front is going to move through. Although we do see slowly warming temperatures getting into late next week, we will not be seeing any cloudiness moving in, and we will not be seeing any break in the sun whatsoever. Well, thank you very much for joining me. I'm Zachary Farnell. This wraps up our typical Timberland weather update segment, but I want to take a minute and go over again the damage from Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton that was caused by those storms. We're going to start with Hurricane Helene. If you wish to stay with me on this adventure as we look through what happened, detailed by the state, by the numbers, and by some of the stories, please do feel inclined to stay. If not, thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to see you next week. So, starting off with Hurricane Helene, this is a satellite picture behind me. I'm going to get out of the way really quickly so you can see this thing move through. This is a satellite picture taken just before landfall not last Wednesday, 2 Wednesdays into a Thursday ago. Just about 2 weeks ago, Hurricane Helene made a catastrophic Category 4 landfall along the Big Bend of Florida. It was arguably worst case scenario. I'll give you a sort of a story to set the scene for how quickly this thing actually intensified. I recorded my segment 2 weeks ago that included a Hurricane Helene forecast about 3 p.m. And by the time that I was done getting back down from the middle school where I record and editing, and I ended up throwing the whole video together, I had to put on a disclaimer that my information was from 3 p.m. because it was just 1 hour later, 4 p.m., and it had already cleared out the eye, and it had already been declared a Category 3 hurricane. So I started recording, it was a Category 2, and I mentioned the eye didn't look that clear. It had a couple question marks. It answered all the questions within 1 hour and ended up becoming a 45 to 150 mile per hour Category 4 hurricane as it made landfall along the Big Bend of Florida. It was arguably worst case scenario for parts of Florida there, where areas received up to 15 feet of storm surge and extremely strong winds. But I want you to notice something north of this hurricane where the real catastrophic effects ended up coming. We have Hurricane Helene down here, and we have these extending rain bands all the way to the north associated with a couple different systems that moved through over the few days beforehand. North Carolina, Western Virginia, South Carolina, Northern Georgia, and Eastern Tennessee all were saturated. Those parts of the southern Appalachian Mountains had experienced heavy rainfall in the days leading up to Hurricane Helene. So let's take a look at the rainfall map. This is where the worst of the storm really came to be. Looking at this map here, you can kind of see where we got the worst of the rain. Anywhere in those dark reds, you can see upwards of a foot of rainfall. And this doesn't show it, but in towards these parts of North Carolina, they received up to 2 feet. In fact, the highest point recorded 31 inches of rainfall along the Appalachian Mountains in western North Carolina. It's simply unsurvivable to deal with flooding of that caliber when the ground is already that saturated from what we've seen before. So the damage looked a lot like this, what you're seeing behind me right now. Tragically, over 230 people have been recorded as dead from Hurricane Helene, most of them coming in the Appalachian Mountains of western North Carolina. Still, hundreds are unaccounted for and missing as we continue the search beyond just beyond just storm surge flooding in Florida, and really get into some extremely isolated communities in the rural parts of North Carolina. Again, up to 30 inches of rain fell and 15 feet of storm surge along the Big Bend of Florida. $30 to $50 billion in estimated damage has been done by Hurricane Helene, marking it as one of the costliest storms in U.S. history. And a National Weather Service out of North Carolina said that this was the worst flooding they have ever seen in their history. Many recording it as the worst flood in the history of North Carolina as a state, entirely dating back to the mid-1850s. So this storm ended up becoming one of the deadliest in modern United States history, And as we continue to look forward at any potential rainfall that falls across this area, we need to keep in mind these areas are still isolated, and the infrastructure across much of this area was simply erased, simply destroyed. Much of this area was completely washed away in some of the worst flooding we've ever seen in the history of this country. Simply put, many of these areas will never be the same. And Hurricane Helene will go down as a clearly retired hurricane name, one that will go in the record books as one of the worst in modern United States history as we begin to pick up the pieces from over $50 billion in damage and one of the costliest hurricanes, one of the deadliest hurricanes since Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Now, Hurricane Milton, thankfully, did not bring nearly as adverse impacts to the continental U.S., although it had a very much more extreme peak over the Gulf of Mexico. This is a satellite picture you're seeing behind me. We have infrared showing how cold the cloud tops are, and a normal satellite picture kind of giving you an idea of what this hurricane looked like around its peak. This storm was actually the strongest in terms of its pressure. The lower the pressure, the stronger the storm. So it had the lowest pressure since Hurricane Wilma in 2005. It ended up going on to be the 5th strongest hurricane in Atlantic history, although it reached this peak while it was over the Gulf of Mexico and only brought mild impacts at the time to the Yucatan Peninsula. By the time that it reached its peak, it was clear it was not going to be a Category 5 rolling into Florida, very thankfully. But as it did approach as a Category 3 hurricane and eventually made landfall with winds of 120 miles per hour, up to 50 tornadoes were spawned across the state. This is an example of one of them, an EF2 that occurred in the central part of Florida. Those brought some of the worst damage we saw from Hurricane Milton as we continued to see over and over and over supercells spawned by a hurricane training over the same areas, bringing multiple tornadoes to some communities back to back to back. Now, Hurricane Milton has of course, right now moved off of the Florida Peninsula, but we are still picking up the pieces and getting an idea of just how devastating it was. I would like to put this footnote before we kind of get into the numbers here. Hurricane Milton was not expected to be nearly as damaging as Helene. However, it did still underachieve to some degree. In terms of the damage that occurred to the United States, we were spared extremely, and we were very thankful. We should be very thankful and very lucky to have had only these many deaths. Now, with that said, we still do have upwards of 9 to 10 reported fatalities. 18 inches of rain fell at the highest point in the state. 7 feet of storm surge reported so far, a much lower number than what could have occurred if we saw this storm reach its worst case scenario. Over 19 tornadoes have been confirmed by the National Weather Service. However, up to 50 are expected to be confirmed, and it had a peak of 180 miles per hour, making it the 5th strongest hurricane in Atlantic history. I'd like to thank you for joining me for a quick recap of Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton. I hope that you take some time to investigate what the people of North Carolina, Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and overall the southeast of the United States are going through right now. And it's unimaginable to us to think about our schools, homes, roads, businesses, everything simply washed away by a flood that's marked as one of the worst in the United States history. I hope that you take it to heart that we are very thankful to be in the part of the United States that we are, as we do not typically deal with such extreme conditions with hurricanes. It's not entirely out of the question for us to get one, however, so I'd like to take this moment and please, as a reminder, be thankful for what we have, because it could be taken away at any moment and when we least expect it especially. Thank you very much for joining me. I'm Zachary Farnell. I hope you join me next week, where we hope to see a whole lot less hurricane activity, especially near the southeast of the United States. Thank you very much for joining me. I'm Zachary Farnell, signing off.